So welcome to the Self Sessions, LeeCampbell.com. Today we're continuing talking about motivation. Got a little bit of background noise, but I kind of like it. Got some people enjoying the ocean out here. Today I want to talk about motivation, and I want to look at it from a couple of different angles. So in the last session we talked about mindsets, so growth mindset and a fixed mindset. Now if you are happy to accept that we can have a growth mindset, then the next thing I'd like to think about is motivation and the sources of motivation, the durations and some categorizations of motivation. So first thing I want to do is think about short-term versus long-term motivations. So the first thing I want to look at is things that have short-term motivations. So a short-term motivation has a sense of urgency about it. So an example of a short-term motivation might be a phone ringing. It could be a baby crying. It could be a chess clock in a game of chess reminding you to move on, or the blinds in a poker game. It could be knowing that the taxi's about to pick you up. So these are short-term things that are triggering some level of urgency. Alternative to that, long-term motivations. Now obviously they lack a sense of urgency, but they're something that's going to drive you to do something in a longer time range. So that might be something like thinking about your next promotion, might be thinking about the end of year sports championship. It might include buying a house, so some sort of financial success, or it might even include finding love. Now, moving on to our next thing, a different way I want to look at motivation. So we've got some sort of time element, short-term, long-term motivations. Urgency is the sources of our motivation. First, I want to talk about internal motivations. So things that trigger you to find a sort of sense of self-fulfillment. These are things that are going to drive you to potentially learn a new skill, contribute to a community, helping others, doing something that makes you feel good inside just for the reasons for yourself. Now, an alternative to that could be an external motivation. So an external motivation is normally fueled by some sort of expectation from an external party. That could be your family, your community group, or a cultural thing. So let's think of a couple of examples. So an example of an external motivation might be you feeling the pressure to follow in your father and your grandfather's footsteps to run the family business. Another example might be feeling the need to join in a community event because there's an expectation that as you're part of this community that you should contribute to this community event. There could be an expectation that you work late because you believe that's what your employer or your line manager sees as valuable, so therefore you feel that should be valuable to you. There could also be the desire to, for example, I'll finish my homework to avoid punishment, or I'll do my homework so that I can get some screen time. And so you're sort of fulfilling things that other people want you to do, I would see as a form of external motivation. Now, internal motivation, often called intrinsic motivation, some of those seem like they're quite similar. They talk about helping people and community engagement and things like that, but the slight difference with an intrinsic motivation is that you're doing this for yourself. This is making you feel better, even if it has something to do with connection. Now, humans are social creatures, so there's nothing wrong with saying, I'm internally motivated to help other people. That's totally fine, but you're doing this from an inner source of motivation. This is something that makes you feel good, and we're connected creatures, we're social creatures, so that's totally fine to see that as an internal motivation. Whereas the external motivations are based on sort of the scrutiny and expectation of others that you're doing something. So you feel this sort of pressure to do it as opposed to an uplifting reason to do it. Now, the reason I raise both of these two things, internal versus external, or also known as intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, are that it tends to be that people with intrinsic motivated goals tend to achieve them more often. That's the research I've seen. That's not to say that sometimes a carrot and a stick held by someone else can't get some quick wins on the board. And sometimes we all need that, I know. Even though I was intrinsically motivated for some of my things, sometimes I just needed a whip from someone else to get going now and then as well. But two different styles there, intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Now, the last things I want to move on to is a little bit more complicated and offers a little bit more research here, and that is some categorizations. Two other ways of categorizing our motivations, and that's one that's based on our needs and one's based on our identity. So first I'm going to look at some categorizations or models based around our needs, and the first and most popular model would be Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs suggests that, or implies that a person needs to move up through a hierarchy of needs, and satisfying one layer means they can move on to the next layer. So the first layer being the physiological needs, food, water, then safety needs, so protection and shelter. Then we move on to connection and social needs, then esteem, and we move all the way up to transcendence. Now, Maslow's hierarchy has been challenged, but like statisticians would say, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I would say that Maslow's hierarchy still proves to be somewhat useful. So let's hold on to it for a little bit longer. Some of the challenges to Maslow's hierarchy are interesting, so let's have a look at some of those. Some challenges would say that Maslow's hierarchy doesn't take into account cultural differences, for example. And in fact, you could even argue that it doesn't really stand up to the test of time, because as the culture that Maslow's hierarchy was written in slowly changes over time, that even over time it's not going to sustain its westernized cultural identity. Another challenge that Maslow's hierarchy needs to address is the classic example of the starving artist. So based on Maslow's hierarchy, the starving artist would go and work for food, but we know that there are examples of artists that just lean into that, being an artist even though they are starving. So what's an alternative to that? Well, Aldifer has proposed his theory, which leans heavily on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but breaks it down into three much more simple groupings of existence, relatedness, and growth, and therefore we use the acronym ERG, and so therefore Aldifer's ERG theory. Aldifer's theory, while it's similar to Maslow's hierarchy in that it's almost a hierarchy, he proposes a different progression and regression model. So instead of saying that you can only move to one level until you satisfy a lower level, Aldifer is suggesting that you will just allocate more resources depending on what level you are. So if you're frustrated on the existence level, you won't put any more resources into the relatedness and growth. You'll redirect more levels into the redirect more resources into the lower levels. However, once you're feeling satisfied in existence, you might put more effort into your growth and related areas. So we talked about different hierarchies, sources of motivation, categories of sources of motivations, but these categories, Maslow's and Aldifer's ERG theory, sort of homogenize that and say suggest that it's the same for everyone, even though Maslow's has been criticized or challenged that maybe it doesn't support cultural differences. I think there's another way of looking at that, which is the personalization or the identity association, how you identify yourself and your needs. So McClelland introduces the needs theory, which I sort of use more as an identity theory, which suggests that you can have three different sources of motivation, and people tend to gravitate more towards one. And those three sources are the need for power, the need for affiliation, or the need for achievement. Now, McClelland suggests that people tend to lean towards one, but some people can be motivated by two or even all three of these. But these just allow us to come up with 3 different categorizations for sources of motivation. So let's see how that can all tie together. So thanks, crew. This is me wrapping up from Exmouth in West Australia for the self sessions on LeeCampbell.com. This session has mainly been some background information to better equip ourselves for future sessions, where we're going to make sure that we're using the right tools to find ways to set our goals and avoid traps that are going to stop us hitting those goals later. So thanks for being with me. Following up now, I'm just going to drop in a list of books that I think are going to be really helpful if you want to go a bit deeper, and a couple of video links. Thanks. See ya.